Hi, I'm Bob Wormsley and welcome to this tutorial. So we're going to be looking at this kind of wispy smoke effect. Now this is something I've covered in a previous tutorial, and we used Turbulence FD to create this fluid simulation. We then used that fluid information to drive X particles, and then we used Krakatoa to render it, and we created loads of extra particles. So by the time we got to this render, I think we had something like, I don't know, 10 to 15 million particles, and we get this really nice milky look. So that's all very well and good, but those two plugins are very expensive in their own right. So I wanted to show you how you can get a similar effect with the inbuilt thinking particles in Cinema 4D. So we can do a similar look. It's not going to look as good as this. It's not going to look as detailed and as smooth and milky, but we can get some pretty nice effects using those inbuilt thinking particles. So that's what we're going to do in this tutorial. Let's jump into Cinema 4D and we'll get cracking. So here we are in Cinema 4D and we have our Turbulence FD simulation. So here we have our nice fluid simulation, this smoke rising up with turbulence and wisps. And this is what we're going to use for the basis of our particle simulation. So the reason we're doing this is that in Turbulence FD you can render this smoke, but it's very difficult to get incredibly fine wispy smoke detail, a bit like kind of match candle or cigarette smoke. We can get a much better result using particles. So in the previous tutorial I used X particles, which is what we rendered, which is absolutely fantastic. If you can afford it, buy it. But it is a very expensive plugin. It costs, it's $400 or something like that. So I wanted to show you how you can obtain a similar result with the free inbuilt particles in Cinema, which are thinking particles. So that's what we're going to do today. So in our scene we have our Turbulence FD container, which contains all of this cached simulation information, and we have our Platonic, which was the object that was emitting all of the fuel. So if you want to get to this, I'm not going to go into this Turbulence FD settings in this tutorial because I went into it in quite a lot of detail in the previous one. So I'll put up a link to that tutorial now. If you follow that to the point where we've got our Turbulence FD sim cached, and then rejoin us, we'll be ready to drive our particles. So follow the link to that tutorial, it's on your screen. Get your Turbulence FD file cached, so you're at this point, and then we're ready to work with thinking particles. So what we need to do is we're going to be using a couple of windows that we haven't got open at the moment to manipulate our thinking particles. So I'll show you what we need. We're going to go to the simulate menu up here, and we're going to go to thinking particles and thinking particles settings. Click on that and we get our box. Now we need this and we're going to be referring to it quite a lot, so I'm going to dock it at this side bit here. And there we go, that'll do us. Excellent, that's the first one. So thinking particles are manipulated through Expresso in Cinema. So we need to open the Expresso editor and we need to kind of activate Expresso. So the way we're going to do it is we will click on here and we want to bring in a null object. And let's rename this null object TP for thinking particles. And now we're going to go to attach an Expresso tag to it. So we'll go to tags, Cinema 4D tags, and Expresso. And the tag appears here, and our Expresso editor opens here. Now we're going to be going into this window and back and forth quite a lot. So I don't want to have to keep double clicking on this tag to reopen it. So I'll dock it on top of these. So I've got all of my views easily accessible here. So here's the view, the viewport, Expresso editor, picture viewer where we're going to be rendering, and our render settings and my timeline. Great. So what we need to do is we need to activate some thinking particles and get them to be pushed around by this fluid information that is contained within our Turbulence FD sim. So this is what we do. Let's go to our Expresso editor. Now I find Expresso completely and utterly unintuitive, and as far as node-based editing goes, I just hate it. I really hate Expresso. But once you do get your head around it and get your head around the workflow and how it works and its inputs and outputs, it is actually incredibly powerful, and it can really speed up and make more ordered your animation and your projects. So bear with it. It is worth sticking with. So we need to generate some particles. So we're going to right click, new node, and we're going to go to thinking particles, and we want a generator, thinking particle generator. And the one we're going to pick is P matter waves. All right, and it brings in the node here. And if we have the node highlighted, here are its attributes. So P matter waves allows you to emit particles from an object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag my platonic, which was the object we used to emit all of our Turbulence FD fluid, and I'm going to drag that platonic into, oh hang on, select that again, drag the platonic into the object window. Now this has to be a polygon object, so it has to be editable. If you just use it in one of these parametric objects, it won't work. Okay, I'll just delete that. It has to be made editable first. So now if we just go back to our view, and I will hide the Turbulence FD container, and we'll press play, now we've got particles emitting from the platonic, and you can see them flying through the space. Okay, so that's kind of what we want. But we don't want the particles to have any speed. We want them to have no speed, but be pushed around by the velocity information of the fluid. So we go to the Expresso editor, to the P matters waves node, and we need to switch off the speed. So if we just scroll down here, they've got a speed of 100 units. So let's just put that on 0. And that means that now they should just be generated and stay on the surface of the platonic. Yep, and there they're going. All these particles are appearing. Great. So what else do we need to do? Well, I want to change this from count to shot. And this at the moment will shoot one particle every frame. And we need way more than that because we need this to look like smoke. So we're going to need millions of particles in our simulation eventually. So I'm just going to put this up. Let's just say to 500 for now, which I think will increase this, but that's a decent starting point. Now at the moment, it is going to release 500 particles per frame for the whole project. But actually I don't want that. I just want it to be a puff of smoke, and then that be it, and then that float up into the air and then disappear. So I want it to emit 500 particles for, let's just have a look at the simulation and we'll decide when we want it to stop. So we've got this immediate puff of smoke, and then it kind of tails off a bit there. You see this natural break here. So let's say my sim, I just want this to be our puff of smoke. So I want them to be emitting particles up until about, it looks like about frame 100. Let's have a look. So I want it to be emitting particles, and then stop, and they'll start dissipating. So I'm going to go just under 100. So let's say at frame 95, I'm going to add a keyframe. I'm going to scrub forward one frame to frame 96, and then put this amount to 0. Okay, good. And I'll just hide that again. All right, so now it's going to be creating 500 particles a frame up until 100, and then it'll stop generating them. Perfect. So at the moment, obviously they're standing still, and we need to get the particles to follow the movement of our Turbulence FD sim. So we need to go back into Expresso to do this. And this is going to seem, if you haven't used Expresso before, incredibly complicated and unintuitive. But just follow along, bear with me. It does make sense in the end. All right, so what we need to do is we need to say, take these particles, get the position data from the velocity of this simulation in turbulence, and pass that back into the particles so they move along with it. So what we need to do is we need to get a few new nodes here. I'm going to right click, new node, thinking particles, and I want an initiator. and a P pass. So this is saying take all of the particles and do something with them. Right. So I'm also going to have to drag in my Turbulence FD container. If you hold Control or Command and double click, it'll kind of maximize it so you can see everything that's in it. Okay, so we're going to need that. We are also going to need a get data node, because I need to get the data of the position of these particles. So I'm going to right click, new node, thinking particles, helper, get data. Okay, cool. So I'm going to get the data from these particles, and I want to spit out the position of those particles. Okay, so that's going to be that position. Okay, cool. So now what do we need to do? Well, we're going to use a special Turbulence FD node that comes with Turbulence. So if I right click, new node, and we're going to go to thinking particles. And actually, no, sorry, that's wrong. So the old way of doing it would be you'd go to thinking particles, and at the bottom you can see there's a Turbulence FD one, and there's a P fluid node. And this would be a really simple way of getting your particles to follow the fluid. For some reason, this node doesn't seem to work anymore. I don't know if it's an update in thinking particles or an update in Turbulence or what, but it no longer works. So we're not going to use that, but fortunately there is another Turbulence FD node which you can find in the general Expresso menu, and here's the other Turbulence one, and it's called Get Fluid Data, and this still works. Okay, so what we need to do is this. We need to get the fluid data from this container. So this object is going to be that fluid container, and the position, let me just control and double click to make this big. I'm going to pull this bit down to the bottom, and the position is going to be the particle position. All right, so already looking confusing as hell, but bear with me. So it's going to get the fluid data of this Turbulence FD container, and the data we want to get is the velocity information. So let's click that. All right. So now what we need to be able to do is take this velocity data and set it to our particles. So we need to go to right click, new node, thinking particles, standard, set data. There it is. So the particle we want to set the data onto are these ones, all particles. Very good. And the data we want to set is the velocity of, just double click on that, and we'll feed in the output velocity from our Turbulence FD container into the input of the particle. So now, after all of that, if this works correctly, if we press play, there we go. The particles are moving with the sim, and if I just make that visible, the particles are moving with the velocity of our fluid information. Fantastic, it's working. Great. So let's just disable turbulence. Excellent. So now we have this sim. And I don't like the way those particles were kind of hanging around at the bottom of this simulation. So I think we can stop the emission around this point, 80 frames. So let's make an adjustment to that keyframe. The quickest way to adjust that keyframe is probably to go to timeline, and we've got our P matter waves node here, and it was the shot parameter. So if I select shot and press H, it frames those two keyframes, and here are our two keyframes. So this was the switch off keyframe. We put the value down to 0 particles, and here is the amount, and it is 500, and it's at frame 95. So let's put that one back down to frame 85, and let's put this one to frame 86. So all we've done is move those keyframes along a bit so it'll stop emitting more quickly. It'll stop emitting on frame 86 rather than on frame 96. So let's see what difference that makes in our simulation. So the particles are going up. Actually, let's just, as default, the particles are displayed as these things called these crosses. They call them ticks. And here is the menu in our particle settings of what's being displayed. Let's put dots, because that's going to be closer to what we're rendering. All right, that looks better. And I'm just going to move this out a bit because there's a particle counter that tells us how many particles we have active in our scene. Here it is. So we're at 30,000 particles. So here's our sim being pushed by the liquid, wisping its way along. And there they go, and then they're gradually fading out. All right. So let's just have a look at what more options we've got in our particle emitter. Now, the particle life is 75 frames, so each particle will live for 75 frames, but then they're all dying at the same age. I think we need to have some life variation, which means that it'll feel like the smoke is dissipating a little bit more slowly and a bit more realistically. So I'm going to up the particle life to around 150 frames, but I'm going to put a lot of variation in, maybe 30%, not 300%, 30% variation. That looks good. Yeah, that'll do. So let's just have another look at this now. So there should be a nicer fall off of the kind of smoke dissipating when we get nearer the end of the simulation. So we've got 30,000, 40,000 particles. So that's the total, 40,000 particles. And now they're starting to die off. Slowly dying off. And there, they've faded out. Great. All right, that looks good. So I'm still not hugely pleased with the particles that are hanging around at the bottom here. I'll show you what I mean when we get to that part of the sim. So these ones that start going now, as the Turbulence FD simulation is changing, these don't get lifted up as much as I'd like, and they just kind of hang around at the bottom, and I don't like that. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my timeline, press my shot, press H to frame those keyframes. And actually, if we just zoom out a bit by holding the number 2 button and dragging, we can zoom out. And actually, what I can do is I can just drag these keyframes let's pull it down so they stop emitting even more quickly. Let's have a go at that. So there we go, emitting them. Now, hopefully, we're not going to get as much blobbiness because they'll stop emitting now. And it's lifting up. Yeah, that's what I want. So the little bit's hanging around, but that's going to look nice as it dissipates. Okay, very good. And we'll start to see them disappear now. And then they're faded out. Great, that looks good. So that'll do us for the simulation, that's fine. We need far more particles. At the moment, we've got about, as I said, 40,000. We need really over 1 million, I would say, or perhaps even 2 million. So what I'm going to do, this is the maximum particles that the scene will allow. So it'll keep spitting them out until it reaches 1 million, and then it'll clamp it at that and won't allow any more. I'm just going to put that to 2, and then I'm going to adjust how many particles are being spat out in our P matters waves. So at the moment, the shot is on 500. I think we're going to need close to possibly between 5 and 10,000 per frame, even more, 20,000 per frame, I think. So I'll go back to my timeline. I'm going to select this keyframe and I'm going to change it from 500 to 20,000. Okay. And we'll see that it might not be enough. It might be. Let's just have a go. Now, this is going to grind to a halt now. This is going to go incredibly slowly. But we've got 100,000 particles, 200,000 particles. So as it's dealing with more particles, obviously the viewport starts to grind to an absolute halt. Let's just go into the display and put none. So it's not having to spend resources drawing all of those particles, even though it's still creating them. They're still there. So now we're up to 500,000 particles by frame 24, 25. So all in all, before the particles start dying off, we're going to get to over the million mark, which is kind of what we want, to have this looking as detailed as we want. So we're up to 700,000 particles now, just about. Approaching frame 40. So as you can see, it's very, very slow, isn't it? And this is one of the limitations of thinking particles. It's a lot slower than X particles in this kind of simulation mode, and there isn't really a proper cache option, so you just have to keep simulating it in the timeline every single time, which is a bit frustrating. But it ships with the product, it's effectively free, and it does work, so let's not complain. Okay, so I'm just going to stop there. We're at kind of 900,000 particles, so let's just press stop. Fingers crossed it's not going to crash. Great, and we'll just make them visible again. So we've got a very heavily populated particle scene here. But if I hit render, nothing's going to happen apart from our platonic. And that's because obviously particles don't just render. We need to apply a shader to them. So this is how we render thinking particles. Let's just hide that platonic. This is how we render thinking particles. There's a couple of steps we need to do. First of all, we need to create what's called a particle geometry object. And we get that by going to the Simulate menu and going to Thinking Particles and Particle Geometry. So let's click on that, and it appears in our Object Manager here. Then what we need to do is tell it which particles do you want to render in this particle geometry. And we haven't used lots of particle groups because we're just rendering one group of particles. So we just got one group, which is all of them. So let's drag all of them into there. So basically, this particle geometry will render every single particle in this scene. Great. So then what we're going to do, we're going to render this with the hair shader. And there's a couple of things we need to do first before we can do it. We need to apply a hair render tag to the geometry. So we go to tags, hair tags, and render. And then what we need to do is create a hair shader. So we go to create, shader. Now this is just off your screen, but just below this there is one called hair material, which I'll click on, and it brings in our hair material. Great, so let's just open that up. So this is what we're going to do. If we just let's just render it as it is by default. So by default we have color activated, and we have this brown ramp. We have specular activated, which has given us a specular highlight. And we have thickness activated, which at the root of the hair it's 1 centimeter, and it graduates down to 0.1 of a centimeter at the tip. So it's the root getting thinner to the tip. So if we just hit render, actually let's drag that material onto the particle geometry. Okay, cool. Then we'll hit render, and we get this horrible looking render that looks pretty gross. That's not what we want, and that's because this is set up to render hair. But we've got the brown hair here, and then this is the specular highlight. So this is just using the default light, which isn't good. So we'll just bring a light into our scene. Let's just zoom out a wee bit. Click on a light. A point light will be fine. So I'll just drag this up, cross on the X, and bring it a little bit closer to us. And in the light, we'll just make some soft shadows. Okay, so we've got a light in the scene now. So what we want to do is make this a particle smoke shader rather than making hair. So the first thing we're going to do in the color, I'm going to select this knot and delete it because we don't need a gradient because it's just kind of effectively rendering a spot. It's not a length of hair. And then I'll double click on this one and I'm just going to make it white. So the color's white. Cool, now we can forget about color. We're going to deactivate specular because we don't need it. And thickness, we are going to bring it down to a uniform thickness. I'm just going to start with 0.1 on both. Now let's hit render and see what we get. All right, so this is starting to get to the look of what we want. So now it's really important that we use transparency in this shader. If we don't use transparency, we're going to get loads of really bad flickering. So we're going to use transparency. So let's activate it. And this transparency gradient, all it means is where it is black, it has no transparency. And where it is white, it has full transparency. And then the grey values, kind of a gradient in between. So what this gradient is saying is, at the root, our hair is completely opaque. And at the tip, it has a certain level of transparency. Now, again, we're not rendering a length of hair, so we don't need it to pass down it. It's just a spot. It's a point. So I can delete this one. We don't need that. And what you want is, you want this to be virtually 100% transparent, which would be complete white. So a complete white is at 100%. So let's just put that down to 99%. So you see in the preview, it's disappeared just about because it's almost 100%. But we've got so many particles overlapping each other that it should be visible. So let's have a render. All right, and there we go. And we're getting this wispy, smoky look. And that's looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to activate our turbulence to see how big an area we need. Okay, so this area is going to contain our whole sim from the bottom to the top. Very good. So let's just deactivate that again. Right, so I think we're ready to do a preview render. So what are we going to do? We'll go to our render settings, and in output, I'll just leave this as the default small size so we get a bit of a quicker render. And in the frame range, I'm going to go manual from frame 0, and I think by frame 300 they'll all have disappeared. Good. In the save menu, I won't bother saving it for now. Actually, I'm just going to render it to the picture viewer, so we don't need to do that. And in the anti-aliasing, let's go on to best, and we'll go on to the gauze animation setting, which should blur the anti-aliasing out a little bit, so hopefully reduce any kind of flicker. We can deactivate the Turbulence FD renderer because we're not using that. And in the hair renderer, I'm not sure actually if this will make much difference in this instance, but I'm just going to change this from vertex to pixel. Pixel is a much more accurate hair render, but it can take longer. But I'm just going to double click on it. I don't know if, because we're rendering particle points, whether that makes any difference or not. But let's just select it for safety's sake. Okay, great. So I think that's us. So I'm going to hit render to picture viewer. Okay. And it'll start chugging away. Here we go. And at the moment, we haven't got that many particles at the scene at this stage, so it's only taking a second per frame. But this is going to get longer as we get nearer this total of near 1 million particles. So what I'll do is I'll pause the tutorial here, and I'll come back to you once this render's finished, and we can have a look, and I'll tell you how long it took. So here we are back in Cinema 4D. That render has finished. So I'll just make a bit more room here so we can see this sim. Right. So at the kind of longest point, it was 7 seconds, 8 seconds per frame to render. And those 300 frames took 17 minutes. So let's just have a play through. So I'll just cache them all. Here's the real time. And there we go. So we've got this lovely wispiness. We've got some detail. And then it pitters out and disappears a little bit. So let's just watch that again. In fact, we don't need to. Let's put it down to 250. 250. Okay. There we go. So here it is in real time. So we're still getting lovely detail from that, much more detail than we would have done from the Turbulence file. We've got a little bit of speckliness, so perhaps we could have benefited from having more particles. And you can also see there's a slight little bit of flickeriness, which I haven't been able to avoid using thinking particles and hair. But what I'd say is, if you'd practice using a few different tricks in the composite with this, you could perhaps use 2 different layers. First layer you could blur out a little bit, and then you could perhaps screen another layer on the top, and I think that would probably reduce the effect of that flickering, and also make it look a little bit kind of whiter and more illuminated. But this is a nice look, relatively simple to set up, and as long as you get that Expresso bit down correctly, then you're going to be laughing. So I'll just quickly jump back to the Expresso editor. So this is the part that we need to get right. I know it's unintuitive if you're not used to it, but it's the more you use it, the more it becomes obvious, and the more intuitive it seems to become. If you're not bothered about learning it, just copy what I've done with these nodes and you will get the same effect. So that's it. That's how we can use Turbulence FD to drive the inbuilt thinking particles in Cinema 4D. So if you could like the video, that would be fantastic. If you haven't already, if you could subscribe to me, that would help me out a lot. And check back soon, where there'll be loads more cool Cinema 4D tutorials. All right, so until next time, see ya.